Hello and welcome to the Literary Lair, and to our 6th anniversary. 6 years I've been doing this show, and what a ride it has been. I mean, if you told me when I started this show that I'd still be doing this 6 years later, and that I would have 529 subscribers, I'd be extremely disappointed. I should have way more subscribers by now. Obviously, you people wouldn't know quality content if it was sitting right on your screen. And yes, I am talking to you, person who watches my videos but hasn't subscribed yet. YouTube upped their arbitrary limit again. Get to it. Anyway, since it's the anniversary episode, that means another Doctor Who book. And this year, it's finally time to look at a novelization featuring who is possibly the most polarizing Doctor to ever hold the role. At least before Jodie Whittaker, that is. The 6th Doctor, as played by Colin Baker. This one was a tough one to decide, because honestly, most of his serials belong on How to Fix It, and if I wanted to do what I did last year and choose the one that I consider to be his absolute worst, I already reviewed that episode on How to Fix It 4 years ago, and I don't like retreading the same ground, even if the novelization would be slightly different, but my feelings on the episode haven't really changed in the intervening 4 years anyway. It still sucks. So instead, I decided to pull a Shada. In order to explain that, it's time for a Doctor Who history lesson. So if you remember, back when Colin Baker took over the show tried to go dark and edgy and put him in the Technicolor nightmare coat. Coupled with being saddled with a lot of crappy stories, the BBC decided to put the show on hiatus following Colin Baker's first season in 1985. I mean, I say that's the reason because the episodes weren't great and the show did desperately need a retooling, and that makes sense. But the real reason was that the BBC controller at the time, Michael Grade, who is a massive jackass, didn't like Doctor Who and thought it was a dumb show, and so he was actively trying to kill it. 18 months later, amid a massive fan campaign like Star Trek had done in the 60s, which included the oft-maligned Doctor in Distress charity single, the show returned, but the season 23 that was initially planned was completely scrapped and replaced with Trial of a Time Lord, that I really want to do an entire review of one day, so I won't say that much here, other than there are positives and negatives, and they totally boxed the departure of Nicola Bryant. Though created a few very interesting characters and gave Colin Baker the chance to give one of the greatest monologues in all of Doctor Who. Offshoot of which means that there was an entire season plan that never saw the light of day during the classic era. Outside of Target Books doing novelizations of 3 of those planned stories, including today's book, The Nightmare Fair. Big Finish has an entire line dedicated to lost stories like this from various eras, and has also done an adaptation of this book, but I haven't listened to it yet as to not influence my review of the novelization. The episode, had it aired, would have reintroduced an old foe of the Doctor, one who hadn't been seen since the first Doctor's era, the Celestial Toymaker from the serial of the same name, played by Michael Gough, who, if you haven't seen the Mostly Missing serial, you might still recognize him for his part in a well-known American franchise, known for swapping out lead actors, since he played Alfred in all 4 of the Tim Burton-era Batman films. Yes, even the Joel Schumacher ones. And he was by far the best element that ties the 4 together. So the question is, would the original season 23 have been better than the one we got? Might it have bought Colin Baker an extra few years in the role and a proper on-screen regeneration? Let's find out by taking a look at the novelization of the serial that was supposed to kick it off. This is The Nightmare Fair. not great. It's very disjointed. Because this was released in 1989, it's using what was the then current logo for the show, the Sylvester McCoy variant, which I really like, but the issue with this is that we have the logo with the Starfield time vortex behind it, which doesn't carry over to the rest of the background on the cover, unlike literally every other Target novel we've looked at before. Even Castrovalva, despite being creepy, was at least consistent. And it's a very messy cover with a lot going on. We've got a solarized image of the Celestial Toymaker on the white background, with half the Eiffel Tower in front of him. Next to him is something that looks like the Jujubee creature from the Three Doctors crossed with Grimace. And on the right side, we have the logo for Space Mountain above a miner next to a sign that says Broken Neck Gap. The Toymaker better be careful. I don't care if you're an all-powerful alien with abilities akin to the Q continuum. Disney will sue your ass. The thing is, it's doing what all the other covers did, picking bits of the story and showcasing them, but in this case, I think it takes too much. It's messy. Plus, we don't even get to see the Doctor on here at an arcade cabinet or something, considering the focus on video games. This is, apart from Castrovalva, definitely the weakest Target novelization cover that I've seen so far. Let's get to the story. The story picks up right after the original ending of Revelation of the Daleks left off, with the Doctor and Perry going to Blackpool, though instead of it being a conscious choice, they ended up there unintentionally and they go to an amusement park, the Blackpool Pleasure Beach. They look around a bit and have cotton candy, go on a few rides, and when they check out the arcade, they discover a woman searching for her lost son, who is found moments later, though he's seemingly no worse for wear. They decide to go about their business, though the Doctor is constantly distracted, having heard someone calling his name, although he can't put his finger on who it might be. I know the feeling. The problem with having a common name like Michael is that you hear people shouting it constantly, but they're never talking to you. I had to start not responding to my own name just so I can be sure that they're actually talking to me. While this is going on, a young man named Kevin Stoney is searching for his brother, who also went missing in the arcade, and starts following the Doctor and Perry, on account of the Doctor's strange behavior. But they're being watched by someone referred to only as the Mandarin. Not that Mandarin, this Mandarin, who is wearing what I'm pretty sure is one of those racist Halloween costumes that aren't okay to be worn anymore. The three of them end up on the Space Mountain ride, and the Doctor and Perry are separated, as Kevin and Perry are put into one car and the Doctor into another, and when Perry and Kevin emerge at the end of the ride, the Doctor is nowhere to be found, having been taken captive by the Mandarin, who reveals his true identity to the Doctor. The Celestial Toymaker! Not that one. I mean, I'd ask why his names are similar to comic book supervillains, but he is Alfred, so it makes sense. And then the book starts flipping on whether he's the Toymaker or the Mandarin, but I'm just gonna call him the Toymaker because that's his original name. The Toymaker leaves the Doctor alone in the cell with an arcade cabinet and tells him to practice his skills, as he leaves to continue working on his grand plan, the Great Work, which requires engineers from all over the Earth, though the lead programmer is Yatsumoto, who is from Japan. If you haven't already guessed, the Great Work is none other than a video game, and if you die in the game, you die for real. No joke, if you lose all your lives, the monster from the game climbs out of the screen and murders you. And you thought that old school video games were unforgiving before? I'd take no continues and having to go back to the beginning over this any day. So the Doctor has to escape the prison and unravel the Toymaker's plans before his great work is finished, or else all those rumors about violent video games spelling the end of times might actually come to pass. Eventually, the Doctor manages to use an arcade cabinet in the cell, meant for him to practice on in preparation for being the final beta tester, to instead disrupt the force fields around the cell, which the Toymaker claims is controlled by his own mind, but is in reality just controlled via a telepathic switch, since the Toymaker isn't going to waste energy on a constant force field. This reveals several other prisoners, including a Ventuzan and a cyborg. Perry and Kevin eventually end up in the cell with him, and the Doctor is taken by Stefan, the Toymaker's assistant, to go play the game, while the Ventuzan, a mechanic, starts doing some sort of technical work using the cyborg's body parts that neither Kevin nor Perry can figure out a reason for. As the Doctor fights against the Toymaker's video game, showing a rather impressive aptitude rivaling only the Toymaker himself, and the Doctor learns about what's happened to the Toymaker in the intervening years since he fought the first Doctor. He's been on Earth for quite some time, learning of humanity's obsession with video games, and for his great work was kidnapping people at the amusement park through the arcade to assess their biology to ensure that his game was as realistic as possible. Though it's not nearly as bad as the first version, where he modded the game into being a clone of an old sci-fi show. The Doctor also psychoanalyzes the Toymaker through the game, realizing that the game's premise, a single person alone on a hostile alien world, mirrors his own situation, the Toymaker being from another universe and is stranded in this one. However, because of the different physical laws, it's effectively made him immortal, sort of like what happened to Dave Lister's kids, but in inverse. You know, the ones that he had with his alternate female self, not the one he had with Kachansky, that's actually his past self. Red Dwarf is a weird show. Anyway, the offshoot of all this is that the Toymaker has pretty much gone crazy because of the years of isolation and loneliness, and now only seeks distraction from his games as opposed to thrills and excitement, hence his more morbid nature here. The mechanic creates some sort of helmet device and puts it on Perry, but Perry doesn't know what to do with it, and the mechanic doesn't speak English, and so he can't tell her what to do, so it attacks her, with her crying out for the Doctor. The helmet was some sort of amplifier and sends her cry directly into the Toymaker's mind, distracting him as the Doctor loses the game and allows the Doctor to escape the monster from the game, though Stefan isn't as lucky. And then the Sixth Doctor does something that, while understandable for the darker direction the show wanted, I personally disagree with, at least from my own personal standpoint. While the Toymaker is unconscious, the Doctor saves everyone in the cells and then constructs a telepathic prison for the Toymaker, keyed to the Toymaker's own thoughts, so he'll be trapped in it for as long as he lives. The Doctor isn't happy about it, but justifies his choice by stating that if the Toymaker was left free, the great work would eventually have been distributed all over the world and killed millions when people inevitably lost and all the monsters were released. The Doctor also finds blueprints for other non-lethal video games in the Toymaker's stash, and gives them to Kevin, who finds his brother in the Toymaker's lair, and advises them to use the blueprints to start their own video game company, as the Doctor and Perry return to the amusement park to finish their vacation. The Sixth Doctor is written fairly well. The writer of the original script and the author of the novelization, Graham Williams, has a history with the show, having written both The Invasion of Time and The City of Death during Tom Baker's run. And his Sixth Doctor is actually rather reminiscent of the Doctor we've seen in the Big Finish audio dramas. Not quite as egotistical as his earlier portrayals in Season 22, and more closer in line with what he's become over the years. Still an egotist and too smart for his own good, Time Lord explaining to Perry about alternate universes and such, but he acts like the Doctor, for the most part. I still don't like the choice he made at the end to keep the Toymaker imprisoned for what is pretty much all of eternity. I mean, I get it, the Toymaker was all-powerful and so trapping him was the only way, but I would have wanted the Doctor to at least explore other options. Maybe if his creation had turned against him like always happens with the Master. 'Cause as it is, it seems like the Doctor just decided on this as Plan A. And yeah, I guess one could see this as a callback to Asmael sacrificing himself to trap Mestor in his own mind back in Baker's debut episode, but there it literally was the only way, and it was Asmael's way to atone upon his noble sacrifice to save his newly regenerated friend. Here, they escape and the Doctor is just like, okay, let's trap his ass and get the hell back to the theme park. Even the War Doctor would have felt slightly conflicted about doing that beforehand. I don't know, maybe it's not that he did it, but more so that he did it so quickly. He didn't look to other avenues. It's like the Doctor would normally do. He just did it. Maybe it's because they fixate on how much the Toymaker is alone in the universe and really just wants to end his life because he's been around so long, like a certain Time Lord I can think of. Honestly, I'd rather the Doctor have mercy killed him or found a way to give him the release he wanted as opposed to prolonging his life. The Master has done way worse, and the Doctor spared him from an eternity of torment back in the Time Monster. Considering that the Master has done a lot more to him on a personal level as opposed to the Toymaker, This feels especially harsh. Perry is consistent with her characterization from the show, though she doesn't really do much. Most of the action is between the Doctor, the toy maker, and Kevin, and Perry is just around to be separated with the fake Kevin for most of the story. Kevin's story is compelling, and he is an interesting foil to have, compared to the Doctor and Perry, since their stake is just investigating, but his stake is finding his brother. And the toy maker is written quite well. I can't be sure of the consistency with his original portrayal in the missing episodes, but based on what I've read from summaries, he seems to be consistent with the fact that he spent centuries alone after his realm was destroyed. And going from board games to video games is a logical jump, and it shows a lot of intelligence to pop his base camp right in the middle of a theme park arcade, since those things, even today, get decent traffic. As a villain, he's pretty good. Definitely had a better plan than the Master did in Castrovalva. And he is a sadistic maniac, but you also kind of feel bad for him. He's functionally immortal, and his one thing that brought him joy, games, have lost their appeal because he's getting bored of them. It's like when you start watching a TV show and love it, but then eventually you're just watching it out of obligation. He's only playing games because he's bored and has nothing else to do. Dude should get into online video. It's pretty much the best creative sync out there to quell both boredom, and it's really fun. And he was only really defeated because of his own hubris, not monitoring the Doctor closely enough to figure out that he was building a device to disrupt the psychic field, in addition to leaving the Doctor all the necessary parts through the Ventuzan and the Cyborg. Maybe he was hoping for the Doctor to destroy him, to spare him from everything. It's a fascinating detail to his character. He was defeated easily. Too easily, though probably not in the way he had hoped. The minor characters like the Ventuzan and the Cyborg didn't really make an impact on me, nor did Stefan, the Toymaker's sidekick, who I can't remember being particularly memorable. This is definitely a story that's being carried by the protagonist-antagonist interactions. The story is a wee bit confusing. I had to reread a few parts quite a few times before I really knew what was going on, particularly during the Doctor's incarceration. And the story is pretty damn slow. There's a lot of talking and not a lot of doing, at least with the Doctor. Perry gets some excitement being chased around the corridors underneath the park, and admittedly that's sort of cool, but the Doctor spends most of the story sitting on his ass or building while just talking with Kevin. The pacing speeds up during the end, but for the most of it, it's a slow burn, which isn't bad, but it's not very compelling for a Doctor Who story where the Doctor doesn't actually face off against the bad guy until the very end. There's a few moments where they verbally spar, but it's really just the Toymaker gloating and giving him an update on Perry's whereabouts, instead of anything really meaningful between them. Credit where credit is due, the concept of the Toymaker's plan, taking over the world with a video game, while cliched now, was a relatively new concept when the episode was written in 1985. I mean, think about when it came out. The NES was newly released. It hadn't even been released in Europe yet, so this was a totally new idea at the time. And it was a pretty novel idea too, and I think if anyone was going to do the evil video game story justice, it's Doctor Who. Star Trek tried it 6 years later, and that episode was just okay. The idea that he's taking over the entire world with what is essentially Doom programmed into an arcade cabinet has potential. It's one of the unfortunate things about Doctor Who being off the air for so long during the 90s into the early 2000s. They missed out on a lot of story opportunities based on the crazy technology that came out during those decades. And the ending is super duper rushed. We get all this build-up and meandering around the park, seeing all the sights, Space Mountain, the arcade, the gold mine ride, and then we spend a very long time sitting in the cell with the Doctor as he pieces together stuff, and then by the time the Doctor actually gets to play the game, it's the last chapter. I mean, at least give us a chapter of wrap-up in addition to the final chapter where the Doctor plays the game. Literally, the entire wrap-up is over the course of 5 pages. All of this build-up, and we get 5 pages to have Kevin find his brother, the Doctor setting them up with video game blueprints, trapping the Toymaker, and the Doctor and Perry resuming their business. It happened so fast that I had to go back and reread it to make sure I didn't miss anything. In comparison, Doctor Who and the Auton Invasion's final chapter was 40 pages compared to this one's 20 pages, and both of those final chapters encompassed the entire final battles, and the longer one developed its ending a lot more as opposed to this one, where it spends most of it with the final battle and then a very quick and kinda cheap wrap-up. The Nightmare Fair is just okay. It's not one of the Sixth Doctor's best, although it is better than pretty much everything we got out of him in Season 22. Trial of a Time Lord, for all its problems and faults, is slightly better than this, since the Doctor actually does stuff in those stories, and his companions actually have a purpose outside of the last-second save at the end. Plus, those stories introduced a lot more interesting minor characters like Sabalom Glitz. This one gave us Kevin. There are some neat callbacks, like mentioning Perry finding money in some of Jamie's clothes, but other than that, it wasn't a stellar story. I'm almost curious how far this got into production before the hiatus, because maybe if this had been looked over by more people or had to be changed to suit what the BBC wanted, it might have come out better. Like Castrovalva, this one feels like it might have been a very visual story, and so maybe its failings are from the fact that I just can't conjure up what the writer intended me to see, and so I'm left with a mixed bag. It's got decently written characters and a well-known past adversary, but apart from the novelty of getting the Toymaker back, and perhaps because of losing the performance brought by Michael Gough, I just didn't enjoy it as much as I had hoped to. Maybe the Big Finish version fixes a lot of the problems. I'll have to listen to it at some point and make that decision myself. As will all of you. If you can track this down, I don't really recommend it outside of the novelty of it being a lost episode, and the book itself being a neat bit of Doctor Who history. While I wish that Doctor Who hadn't gone on hiatus because that was the first step toward the wilderness years, maybe those lost 18 months were a good thing. It gave them time to come up with a plan, and maybe if the story had been polished a little bit more and developed more, it could have been better. The concept is really cool, and when I read it, I wanted to love it. But the parts I wanted developed, mainly having more of the Dr. Perry dynamic that I thought was a highlight of Colin Baker's tenure, and having more of a chess match between the Doctor and Toymaker, dueling it out throughout the entire story, weren't as fleshed out, and so I enjoyed it a lot less than I had hoped. Overall, The Nightmare Fair is a disappointment, and I expected way better from the guy who wrote my favorite Fourth Doctor adventure. 6 years of doing this show, and I'm still having as much fun as I was when I started. Probably even more fun because I actually know what I'm doing. And I'm looking forward to seeing what the next 6 years will bring. Hopefully more good books, and maybe some more bad books. What's the point of doing reviews if I can't bash the bad stuff once in a while? I may have just jinxed myself. And who knows, maybe we'll look at the novelization of a good 7th Doctor episode next year. Maybe Remembrance of the Daleks, maybe Fenric. In the meantime, if you'd like to see more of the Literary Lair, you can hit that subscribe button. And if you have any comments or complaints about the video, you can put those in the comment section below. And if you want to be notified of new uploads, you can hit that bell icon. And if you enjoyed this video, show it to your friends and share it around the internet. And maybe consider supporting the show on Patreon. See you next time for a Return to Red Dwarf with a look at one of the episodes from its most recent series. Though not one of the good ones. but he acts like the Doctor, for the most part. I still don't like the choice he made at the end to keep the Toymaster in prison for... Toymaster.